Thanks for joining today. It's Kristen Clay, and I work in external affairs. As of last June, I'm the Director of Policy Strategy, although I've been with TNC for a little over 10 years now, all working in external affairs, but previously in a different position. So, as Olivia said, I'm going to talk today about TNC's Theory of Transformational Change, or the TOTC. Some of you I know are quite familiar with this, or I think it was a year ago or so I did a webinar on this. So I am going to go over it a bit, but maybe a little bit more quickly than I have in some settings, and I want to get to a case studies. I want to talk about both what it is and also what it's not. And then, as I said, I want to focus on a case example that I'm working on as we speak. It's a current example. I invited a couple of folks that I'm working with to join, so they may be on the call. And I really would love to spend a lot of the time just sharing what I'm doing and getting your input. You know, this is probably the least developed piece of it is the methodology. And so really interested in just having folks very honestly say, like, well, you know, maybe you should try this or don't do that, or, you know, have an open conversation. So, and I will also talk about a little bit what's new in 2019. This actually started in 2016 with Lynn Scarlett and Julia Boccoletti did the first iteration of this, and then asked me to work on it with them. And then, you know, we've been playing with it for a few years now, and there's some updates to it. And then also really interested, particularly this group, of how to use it as a tool in CBD 2.0, not as a separate process, but really trying to figure out what's the best way to use it as a tool for CBD 2.0. Okay, so first, what is it? It's a guide for staff aimed, particularly right now with folks working on SCA strategies, but really could be a project as well. But if you're developing theory of change and you want it to be a really transformational one, this gives a bit of a guide. And it does that in part by identifying key sectors or dimensions of change. Not that we don't always think about those, but just to really put it out there to make sure that we're thinking across the broad spectrum of sectors in a whole system and all the kinds of change that we need to look at, and that we're looking at how to achieve transformation across all of those. And as I said, it's there's a narrative document which has just been updated. So that's the kind of guide part. And then there is a framework, a 3x3 template that I will show you that is a tool to help think through these different sectors and dimensions. One of the things that's new is I won't read this, this is the CBD 2.0 definition of a theory of change. And we didn't, in the first document narrative, we didn't have a definition to distinguish, well, what's a theory of transformational change? So what's new, one thing that's new in the document is that we actually articulate to try to show, you know, you can have a theory of change, but if you really want it to be transformational, then you're really looking at dynamics in the system, you know, very concerted look at mental models and beliefs and values and so forth. And that really you're working on changing the behavior of the actors within a system in large part by changing how they relate to each other. So it's not just focused on get them to do this action, but how are they relating to each other and how do they make meaning between each other, and that is a way to really start shifting the system and having a transformative outcome. That's a new part. Another thing that's different is we had this very, again, I won't read it, very wordy, wonky definition, not of a theory of transformational change, but just of transformational change. And we have simplified that a bit. So probably could still use some work, but now we have that when we're talking about transformational change, it's enduring change of behavior and interrelationships, which over time lead to the system producing alternate and desired outcomes. The other piece that's new that I want to highlight before I go into the framework itself is living our values. So Heather Wishick did a deep review of this, And sprinkled throughout the document now are, these are just a couple samples that I pulled out of the narrative, questions about what approach to transformation is in line with our values. For example, you could, in a country, you could have a dictator come in and transform the system in the country, but we wouldn't, even if that was good for conservation, we wouldn't necessarily want to support that. So we need to think about, we want transformation, but within the scope of our values. So that's also a new part, is to make that explicit in the document. What it's not is a standalone tool. So just want to be clear, it's not this or CBD 2.0 or this or HET, or it's not a standalone. It is a piece to help think through, and is really intended to be used in conjunction with CBD 2.0. So with that, let me turn to the framework. And I'll highlight again some changes in the framework itself, and also just walk through it for those who may be less familiar. So here's the tool part, the framework part. And what's in red is the changes, which doesn't look like a lot, but it's actually fairly significant. So as people started working with this, we had originally just had that you would have your outcome at the top, a smart outcome. And along this axis, we had different dimensions of change, that you need to change awareness, you need to work on people's will and motivation, and ultimately we're trying to get to some kind of behavior change and action. And across the bottom, we had different sectors. And this one previously started out just saying communities, and then we expanded to population groups and social movements. And actually now we've taken out communities, not because they're not important, but because that's really encaptured in population groups. And when it was just communities, people tended to think of just a geographic community. And what's really important in this piece with the sector here is to think of groups of people. They may be a geographic group, but they could be youth, it could be some other kind of a group of people all working toward a social value, a social movement. So we wanted to make sure that as TNC works on really expanding how we do our work and working at a system level, that we're opening up to different arrangements of groups of people. And then the other really important piece is within each of these boxes, we had for a while been saying these should be results, framed as results, not activities that you would do to, say, raise awareness in a population group, but what is a result you would want to achieve. And folks working with it started really wanting something at the top of each column, even though the idea is that it's a system, it's not stovepiped, but people wanted to say, well, if we're working with the marketplace, raising awareness, mobilizing actors in the marketplace and getting behavior change, before we get to the big outcome, what is that intermediate result? So that's a new addition there. It used to say scale up here, and that has now been moved to the side because we don't want to lose just that thought that we're trying to achieve something at a pretty big scale. Okay, so then a little bit more orientation to this. The public policy is also actually thinking of it as a system, that policy has many parts. So this can cover the more basic written laws, things that we think of as policy, agreements, written agreements, but it also is important to think about with policy that it's also the structure. What are the mechanisms to implement a policy? It could be an agency, some kind of an arrangement. And then the culture refers to people's thinking on the policy. So what are the values and behaviors that we're trying to incentivize with a policy, or maybe we're trying to remove a barrier for some kind of a behavior. So public policy, broadly thought of as a system. Similarly, the marketplace is also its own system. So this part I actually think needs a fair amount of work. We haven't had as much input from folks that are really steeped in the marketplace on this document, but again, looking at not just corporate responsibility, but really a change in core business practices. What are the industries within, that are really important to our mission, that have the best potential to make change, and being aware that if we are shifting, say, in the energy sector to new kinds of energy, that there are going to be some people that, at least temporarily, are sort of losing out and other people winning out. We have to be conscious of that, all those dynamics as we think about marketplace. And then I basically already talked about this, so I won't go over that so much, that this can be different types of arrangements of groups of people. So that's the framework. And again, it is all looking at how do we work with those across sectors to raise awareness, mobilize, and get to behavior change and action. This is just my personal opinion, is I feel like TNC is pretty good at raising awareness. We're pretty good at taking action. That will and mobilization is the piece that I always emphasize. It's not that we don't do it, but we aren't as explicit about how are we actually moving people to action. And example I always give is, I've read a lot about how to eat a healthy diet. It doesn't mean I do it. What is that will and mobilization piece that shifts me from everything I know and am aware of to actual change in action? Okay, so that's the framework. And now with that background, I want to talk a little bit about a current case and get your help. This is North America's Conserving Resilient Lands and Waters strategy. The strategy is already there, but they wanted to enhance the policy component. So they know that they need strong policy changes to achieve their goals, but it, again, was not really articulated, or really good professional people working on it, but it just wasn't really laid out and thought through in a systematic manner. And so what we've decided to do is not start with everything, all the policy pieces that could be part of that strategy, but to pick one agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that is an important actor, and develop a theory of change to influence that agency. And with this case, I wanted to lay out what we've done so far and how we're doing it. So, and this is where, again, I'm just going to be very humble that you may look at this process and be like, what on earth is she doing? She needs help on here. So that's why I'm here, is to sort of say, this is what we're trying. It's a test case. Really want your input. So we did start with a draft outcome, and I'll show it to you in a minute. It's pretty rough. It's not very smart yet, and that's one of the pieces I'd like to know, was it the right process to start with a rough draft and then work out a bit more of the thinking using this theory of change, or should we have gotten a tighter outcome first? That's something I'm wondering. We convened experts within TNC so far who know about Fish and Wildlife Service and the landscape in the United States. And we basically took the 3x3 tool, that framework, and brainstormed. So just starting from what was in people's heads, just brainstormed and put that together. We did a few sessions on that, refining it, and we changed some of the sectors. I'll show you that in a minute below, and really looked at each of the pillars to look if there was a logical story, raising awareness to producing will and action. As we brainstormed results in those boxes, was it making sense? Did it seem like it would drive to an intermediate result into the outcome? And then where we are right now is we're just starting to shift from brainstorming in that 3x3 to putting it into a results chain, because one of the things that framework does not do is it does not sequence things. So it's all there, but it doesn't really tell you what specifically influences what or what needs to come first. And so we're shifting to the results chain. I have a very rough draft I'll show you. We're going to refine that. And then the idea is when that's done, when we're happy with the results chain, that we would write up a narrative theory of change. So that's our process. And operationally, pretty challenging, no budget to pull people together in person. And I'm used to using stickies and working on a wall with everybody there. So this has been all online and with sessions of about 2 hours each. So also anybody with experience on working with groups online, happy to hear that. So then this is the outcome we're working with right now. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is delivering conservation outcomes both directly and through cooperative assistance grant programs to states on the ground that are aligned with our goals of conserving resilient and connected networks of habitat in North America. So pretty broad. And yeah, so that's one piece. That's where we started, and we're now feeling like we need to tighten that. Again, one of my key questions there is, do folks think we should have tightened it first and then done our brainstorming, or is it okay to start with something this broad and then brainstorm and come back to tightening? And this next slide, I know you can't read it, but this is the 3x3 put into an Excel sheet because the PowerPoint doesn't leave you a lot of room. And so here's where we actually made 4 columns. So we it's not a rigid tool. We made 4 columns. We assigned more specific labels and sectors that were specific to this project. So on the right, we have federal policy. Instead of markets, we have developers. And then we have a partners column and a very specific AFWA, and I'm going to forget what that stands for, but it's the state fish and wildlife agencies. So that's across the bottom, and then we did, have our intermediate results at the top, and we plugged in what we thought were, results that needed to happen to get us in for partners, to get partners to this intermediate result of having a diverse coalition of people who are benefiting from resilient and connected networks, advocating to Congress. And then the last thing we've done so far is, you see some little, if you can read it, you may not be able to, but there's some little number 1s marked by some of these. And that is, we tried to start for the results chain, to shift it over, to start by just identifying within each box what's the one result that we feel is really key. And those are the ones that then we started building the results chain from, to start there, rather than trying to plug everything in at the beginning. And so I think this is my last slide before I'll turn it open so we can talk about it. So this is the very, very rough results chain. We have our target here that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is delivering conservation that's aligned with conserving resilient lands and waters. I used, this was from Murati, I used the purple, which is really threats, but to be the intermediate results. So we have those, and then these are the results in each box that we thought were most important, leading to that. And then I switched the sectors to basically be our strategies. So that was something I'm playing with too, see if that makes sense to folks, that there will be a federal policy strategy of some kind. There will be a state fish and wildlife strategy. There will be a strategy with partners, and there will be a strategy with developers. So to just, as we shift to conversation, I'll let you know some of the learnings, challenges, and questions that have come up for me, and you may have your own, and then I will stop talking and open it up. So the learnings, I've really found it helpful to focus on storytelling. So even though it's this framework and results chains, but to just go back to what is the story we're telling here, that we think that if we do this to raise awareness, and if we work on such and such to motivate people, and if they change this behavior, that it's going to get us to this intermediate result, that's going to get us to this outcome. And just to be able to keep walking through with developers, does it make sense, the story that we're telling? Another thing is, right now I'm feeling like we should have spent more time upfront to develop the SMART outcome. I have seen that even though we're kind of testing out how we're using this, that it does seem to be fostering a better understanding. These folks have been working together. They're professionals, they know this stuff, but not necessarily having the time and space to, come together. So this may be true for other tools as well, but to come together and think this through, and it's almost, I hate the word forcing, but sort of forcing folks that know a lot in their heads to articulate it and clarify it in a way that other people like me, because this content-wise is not my area, to clarify what these policy experts already know and are doing, but make it more consumable by others, so that then we can actually have a theory of change that anyone within TNC can read and understand. Challenges, every single session we've had, we didn't get as far on the agenda as we thought, especially working online and the realities of scheduling. So it's just been slower. Also hard to orient. The 3x3 is not exactly something you look at and just grasp when you look at it. And so each time we've met, having to get reoriented to it before we can really start the discussion has also been part of the time consumingness and a little bit challenging. And then we just also are at a point where we are worried that we've got confirmation bias going on. And so we want to interview some stakeholders. And I'm thinking now that maybe we should have started with that. So thoughts on that are welcome. And then the big question is, how do we integrate this with CBD 2.0? So, I mean, we've got an outcome statement. I'm working on a results chain. But in terms of the steps, we've already got the conserving resilient lands and waters strategy that's already done. And so we're trying to kind of come in and just piece out this policy strategy piece. And, started with this tool and with the theory of change. So just interested in folks' thoughts, should we, have gone back and really done a more systematic, situation analysis through the process, or does this sound like something useful? So lots of questions. So let me stop there. Thank you for letting me present this and benefiting from your brains.
Thanks, Kristen. If you will stop sharing, then we'll be able to see everybody's faces.
Yes.
And Shelley says she's got a comment. So Shelley, why don't you start?
Great.
Yeah, Kristen, thank you. Thank you so much. I am noticing my video is not working because I'm not plugged in. That's why. So first thing that I want to say, as and Dan and I have talked about this in the past, is one thing I really like about your transition from the framework to a theory of change is that you have that pathway from left to right across the process of change, whereas the current kind of go-to structure for the North America priority strategies is more like columns. They're collections, a collection of this stage, a collection of that stage, a collection of the following stage, and you've created links that I feel like we missed in the visuals that we've been using. And also really, really liking the idea of using the framework as already printed out screenshots of your slides. Really like your use of the framework as a way to kind of loosen people up to the process and talking through it, rather than for those folks who get bogged down in the boxes and arrows. So I'm thanking you for both aspects of those tools, and I will be interested to hear what folks think about the situation analysis that might precede this, but I'll stop talking. But thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. And just to let folks know, I'm going to take some notes because I want to capture this. So if you see me typing, that's what I'm.
I want to know how Shelley printed those screenshots so fast. I see that Kathy Jack also has a comment.
Yep, I just wanted to say thank you. I thought this was so well done, and what I personally appreciated, I'm the Dallas Urban Program manager here, and I have a background that bridges environmental technology and diffusion of innovation. So I loved seeing within the TNC sort of framework and how TNC orients and folks across the board and from all the different dimensions in TNC are nesting their strategies, a way to start to fold in the critical nature to scale and transformation of basically changes in behavior. And so I really love the idea that you're looking at a way to integrate this into CBD 2.0 to get people thinking from the beginning all the way through the results change about what it's really going to take to get to scale with all of these different complex actors. I think it's incredibly well done. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Anna. Oh, wait, Sarah. Sorry, Sarah, you have a question. Then Anna, then Christina.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Thanks, Kristen. That was great. And I, as I always am, was super happy to see a results chain in there. I just happen to be a fan of results chains, but I know from experience that teams sometimes have a hard time wrapping their heads around them, or they just get caught up with all the boxes. So and I was interested in what you were saying about the 3x3. What it looked like to me was you would kind of use it as a bit of an intermediary tool between, coming up with the outcome, developing the theory of transformational change, and developing the results chain. That the 3x3 was a way of kind of getting the juices flowing, getting those thoughts out there. But I did hear you say that it was maybe not a perfect tool for that. And I'm wondering if in using it, you might have had any thoughts about how it could potentially be improved or modified. I'm always looking for, tools like that can help teams. I must say I looked at it and I don't find it particularly intuitive. So I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on ways that that tool could be improved.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Is once people are oriented to it, then we had quite good conversation, but it's not particularly intuitive, exactly what you said. And so I don't have the answer yet, but any thoughts folks have, I do feel like that's something we need to work toward, is how to, on the one hand, the whole purpose of it is to help us think about the complexity. And so in a way, it is just not going to be completely intuitive because it's trying to get you to think about complexity. But I do feel like the time involved to orient people to it, as I said, even when they've seen it, coming back to it, and remembering how to use it seems like a downside to it. So all I can say is I agree with you that if there's a way to simplify it or introduce it differently, but I don't know what that is yet. Welcome your ideas.
Anna, you said you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. And I just learned about this, I think it was like yesterday evening, so I'm really happy I did learn about joining. So thanks so much for all your good thinking and sharing that with all of us. I have a couple of kind of questions that I would love any thoughts on. One, it was kind of specific, but on one of your slides when you were sort of giving the case example with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the population group box, and like I just was curious, like how it may be, I don't remember the outcome you were driving towards, so maybe the answer is in that, but I just was curious if you ever envision like sort of multiple kind of columns or boxes that are trying to capturing the range of different sort of population groups. The same might be so for policy or marketplace, like just thinking about the application of this and expanding it out. I was just curious if you have any, I don't know if that's clear to you.
Yeah, I think so, and I'll answer, and if I'm not answering, then let me know. But we actually did struggle a little bit with, first we just had all the partners and the state agencies all clumped into one column as the population groups, and then we realized we had a lot of different things going on, and we did pull out the state agencies that were a particular constituency that we need to target, but we did leave all the rest of the partners in a group. And then even with developers, there's some apples and oranges in the developers. There's companies, but there's also consulting firms that would helping with mitigation plans and so forth. So it was a question, because if we had too many, you could end up with this really long thing with so many columns trying to keep track. So we basically felt that at this point, just as it's sort of getting the juices, it was fairly high level. So we wanted to break into enough groups to see, but it's a judgment call, but not get too much in the weeds. But it is a judgment call, and I think that if we get into then the specifics, planning the strategies, I would not be surprised if then we need to break out further. I mean, your question's making me wonder if it's one of these tools you could use at any scale. So you can use it at the broad scale. You could take the population groups and break it out into 3 or 4 or 5 columns and really try to work out those pieces. So you could adapt it for that. That's my reaction to your question right now. I'm not sure if I answered you or if other folks have thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, that's quite helpful. I think my sense is it sort of speaks to the point that this is kind of a guide and just thinking about the application, but that's very helpful. The hat I wear is one of the strategy leads for North America, and my sense of transformative and transformational change is it is sort of all the stuff you talked about is sort of getting deeper engagement and trying to kind of shift things at multiple levels. And I am curious, and others may have reflections on this, just even the process of developing the theory of transformative change and how that gets kind of internalized across the different folks who are part of delivering and being involved in implementation. I just have had experience in other contexts where kind of developing the outcomes and results frames, et cetera. Those things kind of have happened like in a particular part of an organization, which makes complete sense. And then also what can get lost in translation is like all of the richness of the thinking and kind of internalizing that theory of change, which is kind of really kind of building alignment. So I just, not to say everybody should be involved, but I'm just curious if others have reflections or experience on finding that balance of, so it's not just a document that sort of just gets stuffed to the side and only like 2 people sort of understand it. If you have reflections on kind of how this process can be used to build alignment around shared goals is synced up. Sorry, that's not very
relates
brief way.
Kristen's stakeholder engagement question, I think, doesn't it? How do you involve the right people at the right time and keep them involved in an ongoing way in an adaptive management process to check in on what the goals are that you set for yourself and whether you're moving towards them? Craig, I see that you came off mute, and I wonder if you have a response.
I can just give the benefit of our experience doing this in Western Tuangani in Tanzania. So we brought together the entire team for one day in the beginning and brainstormed on each one of the 3 boxes. And then a small group of us went away and winnowed that down because there was way more material than we could possibly fit into the boxes. And then we came back with a revised version, and we spent another day with about 15 people on the team and came to a consensus on what should be in the boxes. And then in a 3rd meeting with all the team, we reviewed it for a final time, and we sort of dotted the I's and crossed the T's. So that was our process. And I think one of the benefits was it did create a sense of a shared long-term objective with the team, that everybody then understood, here's the bigger picture where we're headed. So it was quite a useful process for you getting everybody on board and all pulling the same direction long term. Whether it gets used actively and followed up on, we're still waiting to see. It's only been about 4 months since we finished it, so I'm not sure whether it's going to sit on a shelf or will have a long life. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig, for that's a great process example. And we look forward to your update about whether it gets used over time. Any other responses to Anna? And if not, Christina, it looks like you're up next for your question.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, Kristen, for the great presentation. My question is actually similar to yours, Anna. And one thing that I personally struggle with is that with all these, trying to work systemically, which I think is definitely the right way to go, but I still see us doing a lot of this work in-house, and then, we marginally engage others, or, maybe we do an interview, or we give them a call to ask them a few questions, and then we incorporate that into our own thinking of how the system works and what needs to be done. And yet, I think all of us in this call recognize, like you stated, Kristen, that we often know, yes, I should floss my teeth every morning or every evening. Do I do it consistently? Not always. And it's, so knowledge and behavior has there's a lot of stuff in between there. And so I struggle with the issue that in these processes, a lot of it has to do with reflecting and coming to terms with its, that the consequences of what our actions what results our actions are getting us to individually and collectively. And so I find it difficult of, how, if we're really trying to work on these systemic issues, if we continue to navel gaze within our organization and just marginally engage those who are responsible for that behavior. My intuition tells me that, there's something there that we still need to figure out and do this in more participatory ways, more than just through interviews. But at the same time, we know that, we can't engage the whole planet on these discussions. So I guess, my question is more philosophical, but how can we reach that sweet spot of like I see us planning community-based work with just, sometimes just doing a few interviews, and I feel very uncomfortable with that. I don't think that's the right way to go. And so I'm just wondering, how can we really get better at that and find that spot of where we feel it's ethical and it's good enough for what we need to do when it's someone else's behavior. So I don't know, I guess it's a very open-ended question.
Christina, I'll just offer a couple of thoughts, and it does, I think, relate, Anna, to your question. I just keep thinking of resources. It comes to a shift in thinking about where we apply resources, both time and money. And that's a really hard shift to make for the organization, I think. But, even in this process that I'm in, I definitely felt a pressure to get going on it and to quickly do a prototype that then could be rolled out. Even with the stakeholder outreach now, again, we have no budget for this. Everybody's just volunteering some time. And so we've got a few people who have volunteered to make some calls to a few external people and a few other internal people that aren't, normally working on this. But I feel the pressure of, if we said, well, we're going to do a really long, this gets back to the situation analysis too, right? Like that would be part of that. If they had come to me and said, we want to try to do this, we want to try to develop a more robust theory of change for the policy component with, by and large, the policy people at TNC are not versed in CBD 2.0. It's just, so, with a group of people that aren't accustomed to this type of planning process, there's policy planning processes that people use, campaigns planning, but this is, a little different. And if I said, and we're going to step back, we're going to do this big situation analysis, we're going to do this and that, it's going to take months, we're going to have a big workshop convened, I felt like it wouldn't go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sort of doing this piecemeal, but I completely agree with you. So I feel like we have to both be willing, and I don't know how we get TNC to do this, but be willing to put the money into the outreach to stakeholders that it requires, and to allow for the time to do it. And, it's a system change in itself, so maybe we need to do a systems analysis of TNC and see what are the barriers to us reallocating resources in a new way.
Thanks, you guys. And Kathy, you said you had a response or a thought on this?
Trying to unmute quickly. I'll keep it quick, but just in linking to the original goal, that one of the goals that Kristen had stated, which was getting some ideas about how to integrate into CBD 2.0, and then the feedback just then from Kristen and the questions. I thought when I saw the example 3x3 that Kristen presented, for each stage on each of the 3 columns with each audience, each stakeholder group, and then scaled and processed from awareness, moving up through building will, and then taking action. There are, within the social sciences specifically, there are actually specific methods that you could integrate in each of those steps that would be appropriate. Like, how do we know we've achieved this awareness? How do we know we've achieved this will? There are existing methodologies, and that was the first thought I had, is that there are ways that then we can create some at least systematized options for folks on the ground. Maybe it's through CBD 2.0 where, okay, here are 2 suggested ways of getting at whether we're hitting these marks. And consistency, to me, at least in options for approaches, is one way of supporting the folks across the organization as you try to think about, how do I measure, are we hitting this mark?
Thanks.
Once again, the need for social science and the lack of resources for social science hits home. Sorry, who was going to say something?
Yeah, I just had one more thing, if unless there's another reflection on my previous philosophical question.
Looks like
no?
not. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is also for you, Kristen, and for everyone else. From what I've learned in systems thinking and systems change, most of the methods and approaches suggest that we don't start early on with a very crisp and clear outcome statement, that we keep it fairly general. And so that's one of the fundamental differences, I think, with other ways of planning. of not asking a group to agree on this is what we're really working towards. Some methods incorporated to some degree, but so and I guess, that's another part where I struggle with, because if we don't have some form of agreement on this is what we're together trying to achieve or work on, it's difficult to find out, like if a couple is arguing a lot and is considering splitting apart, they may decide to go seek help from, a therapist. But that's, we need to find that thing in common that we all want to work towards. And so I'm just wondering how others are addressing that in your processes, and again, how smart do those initial outcomes need to be, or does it actually limit our systemic change process if we early on make them too crisp and clear?
That actually relates to the question that I had for you, Kristen, which is that as you are a systems change coach, systems thinking coach, and so you've been learning all about that process and those tools, how do you see this integrating with, overlapping, being different from what you're learning in systems change? It's related to Christina's question, I think.
Yeah, and Christina and I are in the same training right now on that. So, I mean, one thing relating back to the stakeholder situation analysis piece is a lot more, that method, that systems thinking method that Christina and I are in, and Lex, I know you're familiar with, and others on the call maybe, definitely puts a really strong emphasis on a lot of time on the situation analysis. So that's one thing that's different. The other thing is it's less focused, at least initially, on results, the milestones and results, and it's more just understanding what the dynamics. So what things are increasing or decreasing in the system, or influencing, or more or less. So you're working with, like, you couldn't take a system map and just plug it into a results chain. It's different. It's working with different aspects. The outcome piece, I think, Christina, I think you're right. I think the systems map, it sort of almost allows the outcome to emerge in a way. It's like doing the analysis of the system helps you to identify what's not working well in the system. I mean, you have to have some idea of how you would like the system to be working. So that would be sort of a general outcome, but it's almost allows the situation analysis itself to guide you to what you need to be working on. So you do need to have a sense of a big desired state that you want to move to, but a more specific outcome, I feel like in the systems thinking training, it almost lets that emerge from the situation analysis. In the theory of transformational change, I mean, that's a piece that it doesn't, this tool is just one part. It's not a whole process, right? And so the framework comes with that you already have an outcome statement at the top. It doesn't talk about how to develop the outcome statement at all. And so that, again, is why I also had the question of, in working with this team, okay to start with sort of a general outcome and do brainstorming and then come back, and based on that brainstorming and better understanding, maybe refine and get to something measurable. Kathy, your point, we need to, right now, the way the outcome statement is written, it would be hard to measure.
There's an emphatic yes in the chat box from Shelley to what you just said. Also, I'm just going to read Shelley's observation into the record, as it were. That's an insightful observation about how systems thinking is problem-oriented rather than shared solution-oriented. So thanks for that, Shelley. Lex, I saw that you came off mute, and I know that Dan's been waiting very patiently to ask a question, so we want to make sure we have time for that. Lex, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that one thing I didn't totally catch here was how you mentioned this was kind of following on a previous planning process. So to what degree the situation analysis from the previous planning was useful in this, because when I saw that, I actually had a different reaction, I think, than Christina, because when I saw that that objective statement or the outcome statement, it sounded very high level to me. It sounded almost like framing question, you know, like why, despite our best efforts, isn't there,
Mhm.
you know, it's a network of areas that are being managed effectively or something like that. And then, you know, but if the team already knows, you know, why that is, then they could start to zero in on specific shifts, you know. But it seems like if you don't have a good understanding of why it's not currently like that, then it's hard to really have any targeted effort, you know.
So just quickly, give Dan time too. We did not look at the situation analysis from the previous effort, and I think that's a great observation that it is more of a framing question. I don't think we do really know why it's not working. Right now, we've been really just relying on what's in people's heads that have been working on these issues for a long time, and a lot of that is probably very accurate because they have been working on this a long time. But I think that that's a gap that we haven't really done a concerted look at the system.
Yeah, just maybe a quick comment is that you know, I think that's one of the things with like community planning stuff that we're doing now is trying to shift from using CBD as like a one-time like upfront planning and thinking of it more as like an ongoing function. So if the fact is that they don't have a good situation analysis, you know, just how do you continue to do that over time and refine it? So this could be, to me, that, you know, the theory of transformational change is, it's kind of like a really good check to see, have you done a good enough job initially, but it doesn't mean you have to start over. You just figure out a way to iterate. I'll stop there.
Good observation. Thank you. Dan, at long last, thank you for being so patient.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen, for your presentation. Also, thanks for giving us enough time to talk about it. You could have talked for an hour on theory of transformational change, and you've instead given us an opportunity to have this dialogue. Yeah, I think, you know, one of the hallmarks of the approach is really scale. You know, how do we step up and change things at a much broader scale? I feel really strongly that the situation analysis is essential to help determine what the problem is that you're solving, and even why you picked the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Maybe that was just an illustrative example, but I mean, part of scale from TNC's perspective is, hey, what public land agencies are managing a lot of land, and we don't think that it's happening in a good way right now, either because they don't have plans, they don't have good plans, they have poor implementation of good plans, they have inadequate funding. You may have picked Fish and Wildlife Service because of the state wildlife action plans, because there's $61 million that get doled out. It's kind of like the 50 state climate plan that's happening in every state. But I know that there was, like, I was just looking at one of the AFWA pages, and they say the need is actually $1.3 billion to implement just the state wildlife action plan. So I think both the situation analysis and clarity around that outcome, because maybe it is to, like, we need to substantially up the appropriations that are going to either the refuge system or to the state wildlife action plan network that's been a consistent funding, but it's been at about that level for a long time. And yeah, I think people will rally around greater clarity of the outcome, and you'll be able to get some of that motivation and behavioral change that are part of the theory of transformational change if there's a clear vision of what success looks like, and some big changes that are needed, you know, to make that happen. But I really, like Sarah, I'm a big fan of results change, not a surprise to many of you on the call. And, you know, I would have liked to have spent more time looking at them, because that's where I really saw that logic playing in, and even how these different pathways, and I think it was a useful way that you were characterizing them as alternative strategies that complement one another and come together. So I would definitely focus or can continue to build that out as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Dan, very useful.
And on that, Kristen, you did ask, how do you create a results chain virtually, an effective one? And we did that for the CBD 2.0 learning strategy, and Dan was part of that process, and it worked, and we came out, I think, with a pretty good product. So I'm happy to have an offline conversation with you about what that looked like, just in case it's helpful.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Kristen in the last couple of minutes? This has been a really, really intriguing conversation, and I really agree with everyone here who said, fantastic work, Kristen. Really useful tool. I think we needed this. We didn't know we needed it. You figured out that we needed it, and you made it. So now we look forward to helping you figure out how to utilize it effectively, and how to integrate it into CBD2 in a way that makes sense. So I look forward to continuing to work on that with you. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks everybody for coming. Really helpful to hear your questions and your thoughts. Thank you.
All right. Have a good week, you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Great,
everybody.
thanks.